Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for being with us again on day 2 for our Asia Market Forum. Thanks also to Jennifer and Zhuang and Tudor for their earlier participation. And just a reminder that you can connect with any of them, and in fact, any of our speakers from yesterday and today live, and just connect via the event platform, and you can click on their bio or find their name in the list and feel free to have conversations with them. So before I kick off the second part of this morning's session, I just want to give you a couple of quick facts. So in 2019, the data tells us that Atlantic Canadian exports of all sorts of goods and some services related to goods actually soared to $1.25 billion. And with respect to South Korea, the focus for today's session, South Korea received over $191 million worth of goods just from our region alone. So with that, again, thanks to Jennifer, Zhuang, and Tudor for joining us earlier. But I'm very delighted that up next, we will hear from Peter Underwood. And so Peter Underwood is joining us live. Peter is the Managing Director at IRC Consulting. And he has an MBA from the University of San Francisco and a BA in International Affairs from Lewis and Clark College, which is in Oregon. So Peter has an in-depth knowledge of the Korean market and would be known as a specialist in Korean market entry and implementation. So IRC Consulting is presenting with us today as part of their partnership with the business development firm Tractus Asia, who joined us yesterday and who will be joining us for each of the remaining sessions this week. So Peter, you're going to speak to us about tapping into export opportunities in South Korea. And just a reminder that we'll have a Q&A period after Peter's presentation. And at any time, you feel free to use the chat to type in your questions. And we certainly are going to save some time to run through just as many questions as possible. You can also view the presentation by clicking on the PDF below your screen. And again, feel free to connect with Peter directly at any time if you want to engage in a deeper or more private conversation with him. So with that, Peter, I'll turn it over to you to screen share, and we'll see you back here after your presentation.
First of all, thank you very much to Opportunities New Brunswick for this opportunity to speak with you today. As introduced, our company IRC Consulting is a Korea-focused business development consultancy. We have a history of actually more than 35 years, specialized on helping Western organizations to identify and then capitalize on business opportunities in this market. Tractus Asia, who's your main host for this week, does not have an office in Korea. So we've been affiliated with them for more than a decade as their local office in Korea. I personally have lived in Korea virtually my whole life. I'm very passionate about the country and believe there are a lot of opportunities here. I'm actually the 4th generation in my family to live here. So we've observed Korea developing from a very, very poor country to the modern, vibrant nation that you heard about earlier from the presentation from our trade commissioners. I focused a little bit on food products, but you can see from this that we have quite a diverse clientele. We do industry and market surveys, partner search and evaluation, and market entry implementation for a wide variety of industries. But I've chosen today to focus a lot on food companies. Thank you. So Korea is an attractive market. We've already heard about the size, 51 million people. The GDP is about 1.6 trillion US dollars. It's relatively easy to access geographically because half of those people live in the greater Seoul metropolitan area. Koreans are known as early adopters. They are eager to seek out and try new products. So this is often used as a test bed for new products into Asia. Korea was a very poor country, but right now it's very affluent, and the consumer base is very, very interested in new products, and the seeking out a higher quality and more diversified products. It's a very, very connected country. We talked earlier about everybody having a smart device. Koreans are aware of global trends and global prices and global availability. And everybody is walking around with a smartphone, and everything is done from banking to purchasing to evaluating. Everything is done on your smartphone. I have here Bali speed. I think anybody who sets foot in Korea very quickly learns that things in Korea happen very, very quickly, or can happen very quickly. There's an eagerness to get things done. And as a joke, I say instant gratification isn't soon enough in Korea. You should have anticipated my need and had my product there before I even asked for it. Equally, there are very, very high expectations for after-sales service. Whatever the reason, without cost, I should have my product repaired or replaced if there's any problem to it. We've talked a lot about the Canada-Korea Free Trade Agreement, and across the board, trade barriers are declining. We have FTAs with about 80% of our trade partners, and the benefits are very palpable. Korean consumers very much appreciate imported products. Also, as Koreans travel more and more overseas, they experience new types of cuisine, new products, new experiences, and they want to continue to enjoy them when they return to Korea. Again, looking at food products, of course, mother's cooking is the best, so homemade or homegrown is the best. But for many products like lobsters and bananas and avocados, we only have imported products. So if you're going to enjoy them, you have to enjoy imported as well. Also, the population has been urban now for 2 generations or 3. So the loyalty to domestic farms and grandma on the farm and this kind of nostalgic or emotional connection is declining very, very quickly. I think this buying nationalism trend is declining very much as well. I use the automobile as a litmus test. 20 years ago, less than 2% of automobiles sold in Korea were imported. Now we're ranging in the neighborhood of 30%. So 2% to 30% in 20 years. And there's no more conspicuous consumption product than the automobile. Back to food for just a minute. Well-being, as the trade commissioners mentioned earlier, Koreans are very interested in well-being. There is, like the rest of the world, concerns about saturated fat, trans fats. Koreans tend to be quite slim, but with the change in diet, there is increasing concern about weight gain, and the affluent diseases of blood pressure, diabetes, etc., are becoming quite common in Korea. We talked earlier about phytosanitary concerns and fresh blueberries and other products. There is a tremendous focus on food safety. Been a lot of problems in the past, impurities and problems with products coming from China. After Fukushima, after the tsunami in Japan, products from Japan have become questionable. GMO is perfectly legal in Korea, but consumers avoid them, and you must label any product that's GMO. We talked about, somebody mentioned shelf life in the Q&A earlier. Yes, Koreans are very, very concerned about used by dates. They want the product with a long shelf life when they purchase it. There's a lot of concern about additives and preservatives, even though you will still find that MSG is commonly used in restaurants. Also very important is that there's very frequently negative publicity. American beef experienced this very dramatically, and imports were prohibited. Basically media hype that there was very, very little substance behind it, but the negative media really killed the market for that product for a number of years. Talked earlier about Korea's population. Last year, for the first year, the absolute number of people in the country declined. Very, very low growth rates, not enough babies, and very little immigration. So we have a shrinking population. As a result, household sizes are shrinking. So you have new trends and new opportunities that are coming to the market, as I mentioned here, HMR, smaller portion sizes. We're moving away from the hypermarkets to the convenience stores, more convenient local retail outlets. A lot of people are interested about sustainability and ESG and so forth. This is a trend that is fairly nascent in Korea. It's relatively new, but it's growing and growing very, very quickly. So if you're looking at getting into the market today, that's something you must prepare for the coming 2 or 3 years in the future. Also, Korea has a very, very high dining out instance. Over 750,000 restaurants and bars. Just by reference, that's more than there are in the United States, with 7 times the population. Availability is incredible, great food wherever you go. Briefly talking about the import process, and I think that this has already been brought up a couple times in the earlier presentation. It's very important to know your market. There was a question about wood building materials. Korea imports 95% of its wood, but it's not a common building material. You see no houses or other buildings made out of wood. You have wood frames for concrete pouring. So it's important when you're looking at the infrastructure market or the building market to understand what the market has and what it's interested in. Mentioned earlier, very, very competitive market. It's a global market. Your competitors are not from other parts of Canada or the US, but from the entire world. So you need to know who your competitors are and who you're coming up against. And your segment in your market. Who are your markets? What are the channels that you're going to access them? I understand most of you are exporters. You're interested in arm's length exporting, but still you need some sort of local representation, whether it's an agent or a distributor. And it's important to make that connection proper the first time, because changing is very, very difficult. It's viewed with suspicion by your agent's customers. One thing I might add in terms of e-commerce, there is about 4 billion or 5 billion US dollars purchased overseas directly by consumers from overseas platforms every year. So we're not talking about coupon or local e-commerce sites. We're talking about people who are consumers who are looking at sites overseas and buying directly. But the key thing, of course, is brand. They're searching for a particular brand or a particular product. If you're just browsing a site, then the local e-commerce sites are essential. So these are some of the strategies. Obviously, establishing your own entity gives you the greatest control, and you can access the market and control your image in the market, but it's a high investment, high risk alternative. There are many, many import requirements for foodstuffs as well as non-foodstuffs, electronic products, automobiles. Every product needs certain types of certification and approval before you come into Korea. Obviously, having an approval in another country makes it easier, but you still have to go through the steps. And anything to do with functional foods, medicine, medical devices has to go through the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety. And that's quite a time-consuming and expensive process. And you better be careful when your products arrive in Korea that your documentation is accurate, because if it isn't, it will easily be rejected. If it needs to be inspected, your products can sit on the dock for a week or 2 weeks. And if it's a food product or if it has a short shelf life, that could be devastating to your business. And when they inspect it, if there's a discrepancy or if there's some mold on a product or something, it will be rejected. So be very careful when you're bringing your product to Korea that your documentation is correct and the product is of the highest quality. So just a few tips to doing business here. The business culture in Korea is different. Somebody mentioned the language. Not only is the language different, but Korean language is somewhat more vague than English is. So there's very frequently sources of ambiguity, particularly when you're communicating across cultures. Korean consumers, Korean business people have different priorities, and so be careful when you make your assumptions. You assume that a company is looking for certain things, but in fact their priorities might be accessing technology or perhaps winning a project with another customer and they're using you to do that. So be very, very careful that you understand your customers' priorities and values. Excuse me. Again, very highly competitive market with companies, local companies, as well as around the world. It's a very demanding relationship. I talk about master and slave. If you're the buyer, you're the boss, and the supplier, how high should I jump? There's an expectation that you will customize for the local market, for the power supply. We're 220 volts, 60 hertz, for metric system, for various other classifications that are for Korea. And also the market is very expectation of speed. I use an example. My refrigerator was broken a few years ago. I called the toll-free number at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning. It was a Samsung refrigerator. I called their general number at 9:30. At 10:30, the technician called me and said, so I have to charge you $50 for a call-out fee. Can I fix anything else before I leave? So within 1 hour's time, he has come to my house, fixed my refrigerator, and feeling guilty about charging me $50. So the speed that they expect service in Korea is a little bit different dimension than we might be used to. Several times this came up in the early conversation. Be committed to this market. It's not something that you dabble, you fly in, you do a deal, and you fly out. Recognizing that with COVID, visiting the market regularly is a bit difficult, but try and once things go back to normal, hopefully they will someday, visit Korea, but very, very frequently, regularly. But importantly, visit it when it's needed in the market. Very often I find our clients say, right, I'm going to do Asia in March. So set me up a week of meetings at such a day. Well, maybe that's not convenient for the market. Maybe it's not the right time to be here. Again, you're not serious until the third meeting. So you have a couple of meetings, and when you knocked on the door 3 times, then there's nothing magic about 3. But when you visit a number of times, then they start to believe, oh, this person is really serious about doing business with me. I would perhaps suggest that in the COVID era that video meetings have become more acceptable. I've been surprised myself. Korea is very, very much of a face-to-face country, but there's been a recognition of the need for video meetings. And I think the weariness is not weary of video meetings, but the point that Tudor made earlier, that unless you have something exceptional, unless you really have a product that's interesting, the Korean customers can't be bothered. They have so many people knocking on their door. And you can imagine a company like Samsung constantly called by people wanting to present a new idea, a new technology, a new product, and they're weary of it. So you need to have something truly competitive and truly unique to knock down that door. Be careful to understand your customers' needs. Very often they will say what they need is one thing, but in fact, as you discuss it with them over time, you realize that's a surrogate for what they're actually looking for. And also, if Korea becomes an important market for you, if you hope to grow it significantly because of the cultural difference, because of the language difference, you should consider hiring a Korean in Korea or even in your home office to deal with the Korean customers overseas. As I mentioned, you have to have a unique product. The features and functions of your product have to be unique, have to have an appeal for you to break through the noise of all of your competition that's also approaching the same customers. Mentioned earlier the fashion, Tudor, I think it was mentioned, the fashion, I call it flash and crash, that Koreans are attracted to the latest item, the latest fashions, the latest products, but then they move on to the next one and you're left in the dust. So be very, very conscious of fads, and if possible, put yourself out of business. So you come up with the next hot item to replace the one you sold yesterday. Again, very demanding customers. They want things right away. And on top of top quality, excellent service and everything, they still expect the best price there is. So how do you do business with Koreans? And I talk about making an emotional connection. In the West, we very often talk about facts. There's this, therefore this, QED, we come up with this solution. In Korea, you have to touch the heart. You have to get people excited about your product and your service offering. So empathize and take an interest in the people that you're talking to. And show some interest in Korea. If you come to Korea and the weather's terrible and you don't like the food and oh, this is no good, you're not going to do a lot of business. So have some interest in Korea, whether it's food or music or whatever, and mix business with pleasure. It used to be very, very heavy drinking. Fortunately for our livers today, drinking is not so important, but still having social time outside of the office is very important. And learn a few phrases. You're never going to be a linguist, but if you can say some greetings and thank you and this was delicious and so forth, that goes a tremendous way. Koreans know that their language is difficult, so they very, very much appreciate it when you make an effort and you try and learn a few phrases of Korean. So invest in your relationships. Just as you practice golf or you learn the language, invest in your relationships and spend time with people. And be honest and reliable, be helpful, and so forth. Just a quick comment on communications. Koreans are, as again came up in the earlier discussion, Koreans are not so strong at English. The younger kids are much better, but the older generation, the more decision makers, have a weak time at verbalizing their opinions and their desires. So whatever you do verbally, be sure that you back up with written communication. Be timely in your communication. Make sure that the other side understands what you're saying. Rather than pages and pages of text, you can use graphs and bullet points and so forth, that makes the communication much easier. One of my favorite ones is that you have to verify understanding. Koreans will be going, yes, 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 and you think they understand, and basically all they're saying is really, yeah, keep talking, I hear you. It doesn't mean that they understand what you're doing. So as I said here in the last bullet point, be sure that you follow up any of your verbal communication in writing and repeat your message, make sure that it is fully understood. I'm not suggesting through my presentation today that you become Korean, quite the opposite. It's good to understand Koreans, to anticipate their behavior, work very hard to minimize miscommunications, be very careful of assumptions that you're making and they're making, but important to be true to yourself so that you are who you are. Your values are clear and you're consistent in them, and be sure you treat people with respect. Very, very basic rules of business that I think are applicable all across the world, but particularly in Korea, where you have a culture that is so significantly different from our own. Thank you very much. They made me trim down my 350 slides to just a few. I hope I've touched on a few highlights, and I'm very delighted to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Peter. I think you hit a lot of nails on the head, and it was awesome that you were able to connect back to all of the learnings from the previous presentation, pull it all together for us. So I think we hear you on the culture piece. And those of us that have perhaps done a little bit of business already in some Asian markets, thinking about the China market in particular. So help us understand, and I hate to stereotype and generalize, but if you could characterize the typical Korean business person so that we understand, from a cultural perspective, what to expect, like what would be the two, three, or four, key traits. And again, we're generalizing, but sometimes we make assumptions and
Well,
we're dead
I
wrong.
wish you had asked me this question 10 or 20 years ago, because it was very easy. But Korea is diversifying so rapidly, and there's definitely a multiple generational shift, there are multiple generations. The older generation are quite conservative, very hierarchical, very black and white, and their people reporting to them wouldn't dare challenge or suggest something that the chairman or the president or the boss hadn't come up with on his own. There was we have a word in Korean called nunchi. Nunchi means guessing what it is that your boss really wants you to say. So I said 10 or 20 years ago, or the generation that's 60 years old or older would definitely be in the conservative, hierarchical, very, very structured box. At the opposite end of the scale, you have the young kids, and for me, that's, I guess, older than some others, but still those in their 20s and 30s who spent time overseas, maybe educated, interacted a lot with the West, and they're doing startups and fintech companies, and there the story is completely different. There's a lot of interaction, direct conflict in meetings in the office. So it's very hard to characterize, and very, very diverse between generations. But historically, very hierarchical. Nowadays, much more on a level playing field. But still, fundamental in Korean culture is that there's always a top dog and a bottom dog. That either I'm the boss or you're the boss. Either I'm going to call the shots or you're going to call the shots. So when we do our strategy sessions, whenever somebody comes up with a 50-50 joint venture, I cringe, because that's a very, very tough structure to manage and move forward with. So I'll take care of this and you take care of this, and we'll meet in the middle to discuss it. But doing things together is very difficult.
To appreciate that, and build on that, if you will, with the decision-making process, so that we understand there may be a top dog and there may be the underdog. Somewhere along the line, someone is making a final decision. And are we naive to think that we are actually going to become engaged with the decision maker?
Very simple bottom line is the decision is never made when you're in the room. We have a very hierarchical society, and the idea is, if you just talk to the president or the boss, then he just orders everything down. Yes, in some cases, in small companies that the CEO is a hands-on CEO, that might happen. But in the big companies, there is a manager level, probably mid-30s manager level, that will be processing all of the information from the seller, from multiple sellers, looking at the pros and cons of the different options, will make a decision report, and it gets passed up step by step into the organization, and somewhere in the clouds that you don't even know where it is, the decision is made, and then dunk, 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 it comes back down the organization. So 90+% of the projects that you're involved in, that we're involved in, the decision making is done out of sight. And you will never be directly in front of the decision maker. I remember a project a number of years ago where my client, without even mentioning anything to me, told the manager, says, if you make a decision today, I'll give you a 5% discount. And I just 5% just flew out the window because he just told him, I've got 5% I can give away, but the guy didn't have the authority to make the decision. If he'd conferred with me, I would have told him to shut up. But anyway, so the decision-making process, the bottom line is the decision is not made when you're in the room.
Understood. And my colleague Max from Nova Scotia makes a comment that we're probably all thinking about. It sounds very intimidating. So, so how do our companies, and yesterday we spoke a little bit about our companies, and most of our companies are SMEs, right? There are a few very large companies by employee size, but by and large, they're small and medium-sized businesses. So how do they start to approach this market? And are there some common issues? So from companies that you've counseled over the years, are there some common issues that we should be aware of, issues that will hinder their business development?
When you're doing business across the world, from the east coast of Canada to Korea, time difference, language, physical difference. If I were an SME, my first choice would not be to go across to the other side of the world. I would try something closer to home and try and grow that way. The exception would be if you have a unique product, and I hate to focus on lobsters because that song's been played to death, but it is a good example. Koreans like lobster. There are not that many places to get them. You have a unique product. So extrapolate that out to your own business. So what do you have to offer that is unique, that you say, I'm supplying this widget from New Brunswick, and people go, oh yeah, that's right. Of course, I have to go there for that product. So that's not necessarily an easy sell. The other thing is, we talked about global competition. There's a lot of noise. So maybe your SMEs are the best medical software company in the world, but there's 100 other companies that are knocking on the door and saying, we're the best medical software company in the world. So how are you going to sell that message? That's your real key. If you have a unique product that is globally competitive and really has appeal in Korea, then you really need to break through the noise of your competition. And that's what I would focus on, is how are you going to do that? And in fact, medical devices, medical software is a very, very rapidly growing, one of the 5 key sectors that I say has appeal in Korea. And the challenge is the noise, because everybody else has also said, I've got the very product that you need. So the solution is easy, but in theory, but actually implementing it is a bit of a challenge. How do you demonstrate it? And one of the ways you demonstrate it is you talk about your current client base. So we've done this for famous company X or famous company Y, or government X or government Y. So that's it. How are you going to sell the message that your product or your service is truly global, world-class, and unique? So yeah, if you got that, you got it made.
Yeah, sure. And you're conjuring up in my mind anyway the question about the vetting process. And so how do you know that our digital health software solution could really cut through the clutter in that marketplace? And so, are there folks on the ground that can help our companies, give them some real insight as to, yes, this product or this service is going to make the grade, or, not.
In a sense, niche products in some ways are easier, because you'll find a believer in Korea. So whatever you're doing, whatever your software or your widget or whatever it is, you first need to find a believer or a disciple or whatever in Korea. Now, how do you do that? You go to industry association meetings. Again, recognize with COVID that that's not happening, or it's all going online. But you go to if you're a widget maker, you go to the Global Widget Convention and you seek out people from the markets that you've targeted, whether it's Korea or whatever. And Koreans are actually much more approachable when they're in Canada at a conference in Canada, and you come up to them there than they are in their own market, because here, again, talk about the noise, there are a lot of people knocking on their door here. So I've actually very strategically targeted. I took a client to Hong Kong to meet a Korean businessman in Hong Kong, and then came back to Korea and did a follow-up meeting here. So the Koreans tend to be more approachable when they're outside of Korea. So you find a disciple, you find a believer who's in your niche, in your market, and you explain it to him. You get him excited about it, and then you use him as your door opener into Korea.
Yeah, so it was important for the trade commissioners earlier then to share with us what some of their marquee or more important trade development activities are looking like for the upcoming year. Activities like Collision, for example, where the Canadian Trade Commissioner's Service would be scouring Korea, if you will, for tech companies who want to participate in this Canadian/global tech conference, and then work with us to make some, connections. And so I get your point. They may be more apt to listen and hear you out if they're participating in some of those more global conventions or conferences. So that's a great tip. Thank you very much. I think hopefully I've, kind of summarized what you were saying on that. And so you talked about language a lot. And I guess it goes to say that your sales and marketing materials ought to be in Korean. So
Yeah.
do we need a Korean language web presence as well?
If Korea is a target market, if you're determined to get into the Korean market, then yes, of course, it helps very, very much to have your literature, to have your website available in Korean. I mentioned earlier about the decision-making process.
Yeah.
I wish I had a folder with me. In a Korean company, the working level managers put all of their papers into this tiny little folder, and they go up to their boss, and he'll open it up, and it'll have maybe 2 or 3, maybe a few more pages of material. And if you're sending him everything in English or French, then he's translating that into Korean based on his understanding. So if you can do that for him and hammer home the points in Korean, so that when he goes to the boss, he's actually got something that you've presented, then I think that could shortcut, or maybe not shortcut, but at least make sure that the message is delivered clearly and properly. So yeah, I think having such stuff in Korean is useful, and repeating it, making sure that the message is communicated from multiple directions or multiple times. And again, as I said earlier, bullet points, graphs, make it easy to understand rather than having to read page after page after page.
Yeah, some of us have a knack to be verbose. So Zoom fatigue, we heard about Zoom fatigue, but of course in this era, we're all doing business development, relationship building remotely. So we've coined this virtual trade buzzword. So if we're going to line up a meeting, do we want to have our translator with us, or do we want to have the translation softwares as part of that online meeting? How do you feel about that in terms of providing clarity of our message?
Translation software is making leaps and bounds, but it isn't there yet. And translation is more than just language, it's also culture. And we need to learn how to speak to people of different cultures, even if we're speaking in English. Minimize jargon, minimize idioms, You know, you talk, well, I was gonna say home run, but Koreans know baseball, but still, you know, if you're using idioms in all of your language, you really inhibit communication. And if you only grown up in one language, you're not even aware that you're using. I think maybe New Brunswick has an advantage because at least you got two languages you're playing against each other, but or working with each other. But you know, you're not even aware that you're using idioms or jargon, and training yourself to speak clearly and to you know, make sure that you're using the key points and reading from the faces of your counterparts that they're understanding what you're saying. Very often they'll just be nodding, and you think your communication has been achieved, and they you know, it's just gone right over their head. So even without a translator, training yourself how to communicate is important.
Thanks for that tip. So last question on that kind of culture side, from John, who types in how to best deal with the reputation of Koreans being emotional during business negotiations. Well, true or false, and then
I think
what are the remedies?
I think that the Koreans can be very emotional. It's very individualistic, but they can be very emotional, and I think you have to let them be emotional. And be very, very careful when you're emotional back, because the timing is everything. If you're emotional at the wrong time, you could ruin your business. I just let them be emotional, and you know, let the wave pass over, and then, you know, okay, let's go back to it. I think a bigger challenge is that, you know, there's 4 or 5 points that that you need to agree to. You've agreed to the first one, at least you think you have. You go to the second one, and the third one. Next thing you know, you're going back and revisiting the first one, and that's the frustration part, because they're linked together. You know, the price and the delivery and the quality and all of these things are interrelated, and you know, they'll start with the price or the quality, and then they'll go back to the other one. So managing that very unemotionally and very methodically, and generally I say don't get emotional. Let the Koreans get emotional. Storm out of the room, shout, whatever, you know, that's fine. You have a goal, focus on your goal, and don't be distracted. I mean, Koreans are good negotiators, and they'll use that kind of emotion to get you off guard.
So for the rest of this year, or until you know, we're able to travel.
When will that be?
I don't have the crystal ball, but maybe the end of the year. So how do we approach the market? How do we find the perfect partner? How do we begin to build relationships? What's your 3 tips for us here on the East Coast? Because we're clearly interested in selling in the marketplace, but we need the step by step. So what's the 3 steps for this year?
Well, I suppose the very selfish answer is you got to hire a good consultant, but I've been trying not to say that. Joking aside, use whatever relationships or whatever connections you have. I've done a lot of work in the automotive area, and that's a very, very broad field. But if you're a specialist in, you know, the thing that makes the car do whatever, anyway, that you have an area of specialty, and there'll be technical papers, SME and engineering papers and so forth. And you read through a number of these, and you'll find out, Hong Gil-dong in Korea, he's a specialist in this. And so you start a technical dialogue with this guy. Or I don't know, through one of the embassy's trade meetings, you make your pitch, and somebody comes up and shows some interest. Certainly you want multiple touch points in the market. You don't want to depend too much on one person, because yeah, they may be Korean, but they also have their own interests, their own objectives, their own perspective. So having multiple touch points is very important. But use your industry, use your knowledge in your technical area, and use the embassy. Absolutely, they do. there's a lot of credibility when the embassy calls somebody
Mhm.
and says, this is the Canadian embassy and we're going to introduce you. That's got a lot of credibility. Then, this is John Smith from, New Brunswick. And, it's got a different level of credibility and certainly use that.
Mhm.
But making that connection with the right people, developing that, refining it, and take everything with a grain of salt. Listen, should be respectful, and build your knowledge base from those different relationships. And it takes time and takes patience, particularly going across language and culture and so forth. But it's all about people, and Korea, in a sense, if you make that emotional connection, um, it's a very, very powerful tool.
Thanks, Peter. I'll take one final question. We're at top of the hour now, and we promised to wrap it up at 11 a.m. our time. But there is a question here. We may have missed it earlier. It relates to the food sector. I don't know if you're able to speak to us just a wee bit, but there was some talk about food inspections. And if you had an example of a food inspection in Korea, obviously at the border, at the custom border, and what might have happened, or was there an issue? What can we expect? How do we get things cleared? And if we don't, that's fine. We can connect back to Zhizhuang if you wish.
Again, I think he's probably the right person to help you, but we
Yeah.
have experienced a number of problems with food inspection. And it's generally been because the supply chain failed, whether it's chilled or food inspection is not such an issue with packaged products. It's an issue with fresh products, whether it's seafood, meat, fruit, whatever. And somewhere in the process, the food has gotten spoiled, or they didn't maintain the temperature or whatever. There's parasites on it. We had one experience with soybeans a number of years ago, and they had a certain specification, and the supplier was just cutting that specification line as tight as he could, and one of the containers, or one of the shipments, the average was okay, but one of the shipments, the size of the bean was too small. That was the one that got inspected, and the whole shipment got rejected. So I think the key things are making sure you have your specifications, and that your supply chain doesn't let you down, so that when the product arrives in Korea, it is of the quality that you want. We did a project on pork very recently, and
Right.
in fact, the Korean Quarantine and Inspection Service goes to the supplier in his home country, inspects the farm, inspects the slaughterhouse, inspects the packing office. They inspect the whole supply chain, and they give an approval before you're eligible to sell into the Korean market. There are 63 agricultural products that are under a quota system. So then you have to go through a bidding, not you, but your importer has to bid for the quota import rights. And it's like 530% versus 40%. So, I mean, you're talking about getting into the market or not getting into the market. There's that significant difference between within the quota and outside. So there are a number of these hurdles, and you need to do your homework and make sure that you know what specifications you have to meet, what inspections you need for your product, and make sure that the paperwork is consistent with all of that. So you don't find out when your blueberries are sitting in a container on the wharf that you've missed something, or that it doesn't fit the specs or whatever. So make sure that the supply chain is very, very reliable and robust.
Thanks so much. Appreciate that. So I think we'll have to conclude there. Although I do feel like we could go on with more questions and tap into your experiences and your insights. But we will conclude then our sessions for today. And reminder, it's day 2. So we have 3 more days coming up. of presentations, Singapore, Vietnam, and then on Friday morning, a quick 1 hour again with the Tractus team to talk about some of those other markets in Southeast Asia. And you'll see all of those presentations on the event session on the platform. And again, connect to the experts if you have other questions or want to engage in a private dialogue. So we're very happy, obviously, that everybody joined us today. And we are so happy, Peter, that you were able to take time out not only to prep for today, but also to join us. And it is evening your time, so we wish you a good night. Bon, je vous souhaite une très bonne journée. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful day. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Good night. Good. Have a good day.